Why has Africa not developed at all, although it has been receiving aid for decades? Africa receives $53 billion as international aid from the world every year. In addition, in the past 30 years alone, Africa is said to have received $1.2 trillion from the world. Nevertheless, the problem of poverty in Africa has not disappeared for decades. Why has Africa been so slow to develop compared to other regions? Why is it always back to poverty again when we think the situation is getting better? In Part 1 and Part 2, I talk about the truth about Africa that is never taught in schools. Hello everyone, my name is Kanta. Do you know the total amount of international aid that Africa receives every year? According to the data published by an international organization called World Bank, the total amount of international aid only to sub-Saharan Africa in the year 2019 is $53 billion. This amount is the total amount of official support from governments and international organizations of each country and does not include support from private companies, NGO, or other sources, such as personal donations. So it is thought that the amount of aid is much higher. According to one study, Africa has received $1.2 trillion in the last 30 years. In any case, despite the tremendous amount of aid that has poured into Africa, even now, we see and hear information about poverty and hunger in Africa, don't you? Knowing such a background, it is natural to wonder why Africa has not developed at all. However, in the first half of the video that I uploaded the other day, I argue that it is an assumption that Africa will not develop forever, and I use a variety of data to explain the progress Africa has made over the past few decades. I'll tell you a short summary of what I explained there. The first point is economic growth rate. For example, Africa's economic growth rate is higher than the world's average. In the African region south of the Sahara, the economic growth rate was 3.4% in 2022, and it is expected to be 3.6% in 2023. The second point is poverty reduction. In many African countries, especially after 2000, poverty rates have dropped dramatically and people's living standards have improved. For example, absolute poverty is the level of poverty where people cannot afford even basic food, clothing, and shelter. The percentage of people living in absolute poverty in Africa decreased from 56.5% in 2000 to 34.9% in 2019. In the last video, I talked about the positive aspects of Africa's development looking at specific data. However, you can see that poverty and hunger in Africa are getting serious again. For example, in the year 2020 when the pandemic of COVID-19 began, African economies were severely damaged and more than 40 million people fell into poverty. This has erased any reduction in poverty that had been achieved in the past 5 years. Even more devastating to Africa was the Ukrainian crisis that began in 2022. Both Russia and Ukraine are the world's largest grain exporters. Russia and Ukraine have been in war, so the global price of food has risen, which has aggravated the food problem in Africa. Food prices have jumped 1.5 to 2 times in some countries. As a result, the poor have been in trouble in getting foods. The number of people suffering from hunger has increased dramatically. Of course, Africa is a vast continent with 54 countries and about 1.5 billion people, so it is impossible to explain all of them at once. Nevertheless, there are factors that prevent poverty and hunger in Africa from disappearing, factors that prevent Africa from developing sustainably, factors that make it difficult for Africa to become self-reliant and self-supporting. It is possible to explain common factors to some extent. Let's look at the reasons for Africa's lack of development from the 3 perspectives: history, resources, and aid. In considering the reasons for Africa's slow development, one thing that is absolutely unavoidable is the history of the past. In particular, the history of the European-led slave trade and colonial rule has had a major negative impact on contemporary Africa. First of all, the African continent was the victim of a massive slave trade between the 15th and 19th centuries. At that time, many black Africans were taken to the Americas and sold into slavery. It is estimated that at least 10 million Africans were forcibly abducted. Recent studies have shown that the areas from which many Africans were taken during the slave trade coincide with some of the poorest areas in the world today. To use a difficult word, it has been proven that there is a causal relationship, not a correlation, between the slave trade and poverty in Africa. In other words, areas that were heavily affected by the slave trade developed slower than areas that were less affected by the slave trade. Why are regions that were heavily affected by the slave trade poorer today? The large number of young men who would normally have been the labor force were taken away, and local culture and industry were destroyed. However, the ethnic diversity, to put it another way, ethnic division that was created during the slave trade period, was the biggest cause of Africa's lack of development afterwards. European slave traders who led the slave trade gave guns and bullets to the obedient peoples or groups, such as powerful kingdoms and leaders of Africa. Meanwhile, they had slave hunters attack other peoples and capture for slavery. The result was an imbalance in which certain peoples and regions were favored while others were excluded. In other words, a few ethnic groups and regions monopolized wealth and power, while the majority of other ethnic groups and regions were kept in poverty. The procurement of slaves in this manner also created tensions between villages that had previously been tied together by trade and alliances. Especially in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, African societies became unstable due to the mechanisms brought in by Europeans. During this period, some people privately purchased weapons from Europeans as a means of defending themselves. Conflicts and fights caused by slave hunting led to instability in African societies and the breakdown of the system of governance that once existed in Africa. People began to form small groups to protect themselves, but these small groups never developed into large communities or nations. In the areas heavily affected by the slave trade, the formation of large communities and nations was prevented, resulting in highly ethnically fragmented areas. This graph shows the results of a study conducted by Harvard professor Nathan Nunn, who specializes in the African slave trade. The horizontal axis shows the number of slaves taken away, and the vertical axis shows ethnic diversity. As this graph shows, countries where many slaves were taken in the past are now known to have a high level of ethnic diversity. It is said that in societies with too much ethnic diversity, even if the government wants to implement policies to improve public resources, such as schools and infrastructure, there is a high possibility that other ethnic groups will not readily accept the policies. When a particular ethnic group gains wealth or power, it tends to favor its own ethnic group and treat other ethnic groups unfavorably in order to prevent other ethnic groups from taking it away. This created conflicts and divisions among people, which led to civil wars in later periods, and also caused some ethnic groups that gained power to become self-centered in their politics, without consideration for other ethnic groups. As a result, a situation was created in which the few who gained power became rich, while the majority of the people were forced to live in poverty. Likewise, a study conducted by Harvard professor Nathan Nunn found that if the slave trade had not taken place, between 28 and 100% of the income gap between Africa and the rest of the developing world would not exist. From the 19th to the 20th century, there was also colonial rule of Africa by European countries. The European colonial powers that colonized Africa, so-called suzerain states, operated plantations that grew only crops for export to industrialized countries, such as cotton and coffee, rather than crops for the African people to eat. After Africa gained independence from European colonialism, the same structure continued, and only crops for export to industrialized countries were grown instead of crops for domestic consumption. As a result, self-sufficient agriculture did not take root in many African countries. That's why Africa has to import food from other countries despite its vast land area. However, when international situations like the Ukraine crisis occur and food prices soar worldwide, African countries that depend on imports from abroad are directly affected, and many of them fall back into poverty and starvation. The second reason for Africa's lack of development is, perhaps surprisingly, its rich natural resources. The continent of Africa is one of the richest in natural resources in the world. Normally, one might think that an abundance of natural resources such as oil, gold, and diamonds would allow Africa to take advantage of these resources and develop. However, it is believed that the abundance of natural resources can be a hindrance to development. In countries with abundant resources, those in power tend to rely exclusively on resources for their national finances. Once resources are the main source of revenue, there is no need to develop other industries. In this way, the wealth obtained from natural resources is monopolized by a few powerful people, while the majority of the population does not have the means to create their own wealth and cannot escape from poverty. Furthermore, the creation of an economy dependent on natural resources makes it unstable and subject to price changes of those resources. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country located in the center of Africa, once relied heavily on profits from the export of copper. But when international copper prices suddenly plummeted, the country's economy was severely impacted and rapidly worsened. As a result, despite the abundance of natural resources, many of the country's people died of poverty. Similarly, for example, a country dependent on crude oil exports is in relatively good situation when the international price of crude oil is stable. But when the international price of crude oil plummets, the country's entire economy takes a hit and the people's lives become difficult. In many other countries, governments and military organizations monopolize the resources, and the standard of living of many citizens remains low. This phenomenon of abundant resources preventing sustainable development is called resource curse. I plan to explain resource curse in another video in the near future. Please subscribe to my channel and wait for it. The third reason is that foreign aid has robbed Africa of its independence, and it has become dependent on other countries to survive. Africa has received enormous aid from foreign governments and international organizations, but there is criticism that the aid has taken away Africa's independence. For example, some people claim that the aid from abroad has destroyed agriculture in Africa. Countries such as Europe and the United States have exported large quantities of food to Africa over the past several decades. sometimes in the name of aid and sometimes with subsidies. Certainly, poverty and hunger have been a problem in African countries since that time, and free or cheap food from developed countries has helped the local people in the short term. However, the massive influx of foreign food deprived African agriculture of its ability to become self-sufficient, and subsistence agriculture has not taken root. And even today, huge amounts of food are still imported from abroad. As a result, as we saw earlier, when food prices soared worldwide due to the crisis in Ukraine, poor regions such as Africa were directly affected by it, resulting in poverty and hunger. In addition, in some African countries, foreign aid accounts for nearly half of the national budgets. In such a situation, there is no need to collect taxes from the people, so African politicians have to play politics not according to the people, but according to the foreign powers. This is another major reason why Africa has never been able to become independent. Looking at the history of the past 500 years, Africa has always been in a weak position. Living in Japan, we rarely think about Africa. Most of the world news we see in Japan is from the American and European perspectives. However, when we look at the world from the perspective of Africa, which has always been in a vulnerable position, it is possible to gain a new perspective on how the world works. Turning our attention to Africa may actually lead us to think about the future of our countries. I have found that the more times I have visited Africa and learned about Africa, the more my worldview, in other words, the way I see the world, has changed. I hope you who have watched this video to the end, despite its difficulty, will experience the same kind of experience. My channel provides easy to understand explanations of world issues that are difficult to find in other media. If you are interested in learning more with me, or if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please take this opportunity to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching to the end. See you again in the next video.